When you think of the internet, you're probably imagining something invented in the late 20th century: computers, satellites, and glowing screens. But long before fibre optic cables or Wi Fi, there was another kind of network, one that connected an empire stretching thousands of miles across the ancient world. It wasn't digital, of course, but in its time it was just as revolutionary. And it was built by the Persians more than 2,500 years ago. Now, some historians even call it the world's first internet. In the 6th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, rose to become the largest empire the world had ever seen. At its height, it stretched from modern-day Turkey in the west to India in the east, and from Egypt in the south to Central Asia in the north. That's around 5.5 million square kilometres, with more than 50 million people living under Persian rule. But that kind of size came with huge problems. Communication was an issue. If your empire stretches thousands of miles, how do you make sure your orders actually reach your governors before they're outdated? Without fast communication, armies could rebel, taxes might not arrive, and entire provinces could drift out of control. The Persians needed a good solution. The answer was an infrastructure project so ambitious that it made the empire possible: the Royal Road. The road stretched about 1,500 miles from Susa, the Persian capital, near the Persian Gulf, all the way to Sardis, near the Aegean Sea in modern-day Turkey. Along this road, the Persians built relay stations at regular intervals, about every 15 miles. At each station, fresh horses and riders were waiting. This system allowed royal couriers to travel with astonishing speed for the ancient world. Herodotus, a Greek historian, wrote that messages could travel the entire distance in just 7 days. Compare that to 3 months that it would normally take on foot. If that sounds familiar, it's because the system functioned almost like an early version of the postal service, or like sending data packets along a network. So, why do historians call this the first internet? It comes down to 3 things: speed, reliability, and connection. Speed: messages that once took months now took days. For an ancient empire, that was like going from dial-up to broadband overnight. There was also, obviously, reliability. Riders at each station ensured messages didn't stall. The system worked like a well-oiled machine, with backups if one rider or horse failed. And then there was connection. For the first time, distant corners of an empire, from Anatolia to Persia to Mesopotamia, could stay in touch in near real time, at least compared to before. In other words, it allowed the empire to function as a single political unit, instead of a loose collection of provinces. Just like the internet allows us to think globally, the Royal Road allowed the Persians to govern globally. The Persian couriers became legendary. Herodotus described them with a line that might sound familiar: "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with all speed." If that sounds like the motto of the US Postal Service, that's because it is. The USPS adopted it directly from Herodotus' description of Persian messengers. That's how reliable these couriers were. Their reputation lasted 2,500 years. The Persian internet wasn't just about roads and horses, it was also about administration. The empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a governor or a satrap. The communication system allowed the king to send orders, receive reports, and coordinate taxation and military movements across vast distances. Think of it like a giant server system. Each satrapy was a local hub, but everything was connected back to the central authority. And it wasn't limited to the Royal Road. The Persians expanded their communication networks with additional roads, sea routes, and even early forms of signal flares to transmit warnings across mountain ranges. This system was so effective that later empires copied it. The Romans, famous for their own roads, adopted many ideas from the Persians. Their cursus publicus, or imperial mail system, worked in a very similar way, with relay stations and official couriers. Centuries later, the Mongols would use an almost identical network of relay posts called the Yam, which allowed Genghis Khan to coordinate his empire from China to Europe. In many ways, the Persians set the blueprint for how empires could stay connected. Without this communication network, the Persian Empire might not have lasted as long as it did. Quick communication meant rebellions could be crushed before they spread, resources could be moved wherever they were needed, and the king's presence could be felt in places he might never personally visit. It wasn't just about speed, it was about control. The royal road tied the empire together politically, militarily, and culturally. And in that sense, it really was like an early version of the internet, a web that kept people connected, allowed information to flow, and made it possible to think on a larger scale than ever before. But just like today's internet, the Persian system wasn't all good news. The same roads and communication that allowed the Persians to project power also made it easier for invaders. When Alexander the Great conquered the empire in the 4th century BCE, he used the Persian roads to move his armies faster. In other words, the very system that made the empire so strong also made it vulnerable once control was lost. So was the Persian communication network really the first internet? Not in the digital sense, of course, but in terms of what it accomplished, shrinking distances, speeding up communication, and connecting millions of people, it played the same role for the ancient world that the internet plays for us today. It reminds us that while technology changes, the human desire to connect and communicate across distances is timeless. Whether it's a rider on a horse or data travelling through a fibre optic cable, the goal is the same, making the world feel smaller and more connected. So the next time you send a message across the world in an instant, remember, the Persians did something just as revolutionary 2,500 years ago. Their couriers may not have had Wi-Fi, but they had horses, roads, and determination. And that was enough to build the first true information highway. This has been History of the World. If you've learned something new, click subscribe.